Hey guys, welcome back. Long time no see. I finally got my internet problems sorted out and uploading is working again, so I'm going to create this video and upload it for you. I wanted to mention that you've probably already heard there should be a sign up going up for students that are looking to get back into the school to pick up their personal items. So if you haven't seen that posted on one of your other classes, I'm going to try and hopefully get that up today, Monday. So you have the ability to sign up to get into the school if you need to collect anything. I haven't been into the school myself yet. I believe that's coming later this week for staff. And I guess we'll just have to go from there. So anyway, let's get right down to today's topic. So we're going to be talking about natural selection today. Hopefully you've already completed module 18, where you did the demonstration of natural selection. And this is, I'm going to mention that that demonstration, that like online lab a couple times during this lesson, obviously because it leads into this material perfectly. So in case you're wondering, this is related to chapter 8.1 in your textbook, so which is page 326 to 329. So if you're looking for more information, it gives you a little bit more detail on selection and how this works. I'm going to be covering the broad strokes here, which is really all that you need to know for this course. And by the end, hopefully you'll be able to explain the process of natural selection and how it works, and you can discuss the three subtypes. There's actually 4 subtypes of natural selection. Whoops, there's a typo already. There's 4 subtypes. Oh, not 14. I haven't used my iPad in a little bit here, so I'm a little bit out of practice. So there's 4 subtypes, which are directional, stabilizing, disruptive, and sexual selection. So you should be able to maybe discuss an example of each of those. Okay, so really quickly here, let's talk about this in general, the idea of evolution. So I haven't made a video on this. You have read about it, but I just want to talk about what evolution means, because I think it's the term is used kind of by in the media and stuff, like, and it's not really always clear exactly what do scientists consider evolution to be. So all that it takes in order for evolution to occur in a population is a change in allelic frequency. That's a change in the number of particular alleles that you see in a population. So let me use these flowers as an example here. So here we have the W gene. The big W gene here is for pink flower, or I'm not really sure how this is showing up on the screen, purple, I guess. And the little w allele here for this gene is white. So this would be something that we would have seen in our genetics unit. In this case, white is the recessive allele, and pink or purple here is the dominant allele. So if you were to look at the number of those purple alleles in the population and count them up, and you can count the number of them right here, you notice that there are 13 of those alleles in a total population here of 18. Whoop. What happened? There we go. In a total population of 18. So that means that the allelic frequency, the number of alleles here, is 72%. The population is 72% purple allele. And if you look at the white allele here, there's 5 white alleles in a total of 18, and so it's 28% white allele. That is the frequency of that allele in the population. If for some reason the amount of purple alleles in the next generation is higher or lower than it was in this generation, we call that evolution. That all by itself there is evolution occurring. So evolution is just a change in the allelic frequency. Here we have more white allele and less pink allele or purple allele for whatever reason. Okay, so evolution can be caused by all kinds of different things. So in this case, maybe this was just a totally random change. Like for some reason, a bunch of the purple plants died due to a fungus or something random, maybe in a storm. A certain amount of them died, and so in the next generation it was just more likely for white ones to get passed on than purple. That's a random thing. So that's not natural selection. That's not what we're going to talk about today, but that is evolution, just the same. Just like if this was a population of corn plants and humans picked the 10 biggest corn plants, like the ones that produce the 10 biggest corns, and then those were the ones that made up all the ones in the next generation. That is not natural selection, that's human selection. So we do that as well, and that also causes evolution. So because there's now a change in allelic frequency, now there will be more of the larger corn allele in the population. Okay, so that would be, in that case, human selection, but it still causes evolution. Anytime you get a change in allelic frequency, the number of a particular allele in a population, that is human selection, or that is evolution rather. We're going to talk about evolution in this particular instance through the process of natural selection. So what does that mean? Natural selection is when the thing doing the selecting or picking what is going to pass on its genes or its alleles to the next generation is the environment, the natural environment. Okay, and that could mean a predator is doing the selecting, or environmental conditions like the amount of rainfall or whatever. Something in the natural environment is choosing, I mean, maybe not like actively choosing, but by virtue of its status, is selecting a particular allele to have better survival over another allele. So that is, one phenotype in the population has better survivability than another phenotype. For whatever reason. We're going to talk about a bunch of different examples of this. In your example, the thing that you looked at was the idea of these beetles, and they had better survivability because they had a color that was closer to the background color, to their environment color. And if they had a better color, a color that was better matched to their background, like for example, like this one here, I should circle it probably so that doesn't really make sense. Okay, so like this one right here is closer to the background color, therefore it's less likely to get picked up by a predator. Therefore it's more likely to pass on its alleles to the next generation. So that's an example of natural selection. And over time, that's going to change what the population looks like, because ones that are like this are going to get selected for more, and ones that look like this are going to get selected for less. So over time, the allelic frequency, the frequency of the allele for this particular color, is going to be more common than the allele for this particular color. Sorry, maybe I'm not making it clear what I'm talking about these two right here. Okay. So that's the basics of it. Something in nature is choosing what things are going to survive based on some trait, some genetic trait. So the key thing here is that the trait you're talking about has to be a genetic trait, obviously. So if we're talking about something that is purely environmental, like for example, due to nutrition, some members of a species are going to be larger than other members of a species because they just happen to find more food than another member in the species. That's not genetic. That the reason for that phenotype is purely environmental. It would be like if I went and worked out a whole bunch and I got like super jacked. So that would be environmental. So that's not genetic, and I can't pass that on to my offspring either because it's environmental and it's not genetic. So the traits that we're talking about here had to be genetic traits. That is, a genotype is causing the phenotype. So first of all, it's got to be a genetic thing, otherwise you can't have natural selection occurring. Second of all, there has to be variety in the species. And how you get variety, and this was also mentioned in the gizmo, is by mutation. Once you have some variety in the population, that is, there is more than one phenotype or more than one genotype available in the population, you can increase the diversity, that is how they are distributed in the population, through sexual reproduction, which we talked about earlier in the unit. So that increases the variability in the population, but you do need to get those alleles from somewhere. They need to be created. and they're created through a process of mutation. So mutation is essential in order for evolution to occur, in order for natural selection to occur. And the last thing here is that the environment has to favor one particular phenotype over another. There's an advantage to one phenotype in that whatever that phenotype is, it can better survive and it can better reproduce. So these are the two key things. I'm going to put them even in a different color here. Survivability and reproduction. If you can survive and reproduce, basically you win from an evolutionary perspective. You just need to survive and reproduce. Okay, so going back to our bug example here, let's look at whether or not it meets all three of these. So first of all, the trait in question is genetic. Yes, shell color in insects is a genetic trait. Whether it's going to be blue or pink or purple or whatever, that's a genetic trait in insects. So a genotype is causing the phenotype. There has to be genetic variability. Okay, so that exists. There's different colors. If you did the gizmo, you'd notice that the new colors arise slowly over time through random mutation. That's a random process. So over time, you're just going to get new colors appearing in the population due to random mutation. And lastly, the environment has to favor one over the other. In this case, a predator was the thing causing the selective pressure. The thing that was favoring one type of phenotype over the other. And the ones that are better suited to camouflage themselves, that have a color closer to the color of their environment, are more likely to survive and reproduce. So that was the little fitness thing at the bottom. It said 60% fitness, 80% fitness. That was the likelihood of the population to essentially be safe from predators. So the amount of fitness goes up over time as the color gets closer and closer to the background color. And that's why you see all these cool things in nature. You'll see a butterfly that has a pattern on the back that looks like eyes or something like that. I mean, that's an evolved trait. As the pattern on the back got closer and closer to something that looked like a predator's eyes, it increased the survivability slowly over time. Where did those patterns come from? Random mutation. It's hard to believe that those traits could arise and evolve like that through random mutation, but the really important thing to remember here is time scale. So in order for random mutations to accumulate like that, and for natural selection to take over and cause these slow changes over time, you need a long, long period of time, millions of years. And that is in fact how long it takes. So in order for large scale changes to happen within a population, oftentimes it takes millions of years for those changes to occur. And if you look back through the fossil record, you can see how long it has taken for various iterations of species to arise. A long time, millions of years, a very long time. Toward the end of this unit, we're going to talk a little bit about human evolution and about the timeline for that. It's a long timeline. So human evolution took a long time. At least from what we can tell from the fossil record. So these are small changes that are accumulating over time. So, as I mentioned previously, there are 4 different types of selection. The first type is directional selection. So directional selection is when you have a range of traits caused by genes, so a range of alleles in a population, and one of the extremes is preferred over the other extreme. So let's say that your original population fit a graph like this, and over time, the far right-hand side here of the graph was favored, and so therefore the population is going to slowly shift over time until the average looks more like this. Okay, that is, if you are on this extreme over here for whatever the trait is, and I'll talk about a specific trait to give a better example afterwards, but that is selected against. So whatever that is down there, that's bad. That's bad for survivability. Whereas whatever is up here, this is good for survivability. So over time, you're going to see a shift away from traits that are not favorable and towards traits that are favorable. Okay, so directional selection is when things are always going in one particular direction. So let me give you an example. Let's say that the bottom of this graph down here was neck size for giraffes. Okay, so this is like giraffe neck. And over here, you've got teeny tiny little giraffes. I should have left more room for this. Over here, you've got oh, I'm so sorry about these drawings. You're going to have giraffes with little teeny tiny necks. And then in the middle, you're going to have giraffes with medium-sized necks. And then over on the far side here, you're going to have giraffes with really long necks. Okay, so this is neck length along the bottom. Well, the selective pressure in this case is where giraffes find their food. Giraffes find their food at the top of acacia trees, and acacia trees are very tall. So if you want to get those leaves at the top of the acacia tree, you got to have a tall neck. So in this particular case, only the really tall giraffe is going to have access to that acacia tree. So really short giraffes are going to be disfavored in the environment. They're going to be selected against. And giraffes with really long necks are going to be selected for. They have an enhanced survivability because they have a longer neck in the population. So the population has a curve in that there is a variety of different neck sizes in the population, but the average is probably somewhere in the middle. But over time, because longer necks are favored rather than shorter necks, you're going to see a shift of the average as fewer of the ones on the far left survive and more of the ones on the far right survive. You get a slow shift in the population to longer and longer necks over time, eventually ending up with a modern giraffe. Long neck, perfectly adapted to eat the leaves at the top of acacia trees, which is the main part of their diet. Okay, so that's an example of directional selection. Directional selection is when something is shifting always in one direction. More this, or it could be less this, less this, all continuously in a single direction. Like this could go in the opposite direction too, and it would still be considered directional selection. So for example, let's say all of a sudden the tall acacia trees went extinct, and the only thing that giraffes were able to eat was like a tiny little shrub. Okay, in this case, having a long neck actually makes it a lot more difficult for you to obtain food. So over time, you're gonna see the opposite. You're gonna see giraffes with the shortest necks have better survivability, and then you get a directional selection going in the opposite direction. That's still directional selection, just going in the opposite direction. And it doesn't necessarily have to be length or height or anything like that, but it's selection in a particular direction. Okay, so that's directional selection. The second type, stabilizing selection, is when the average is the best. The most survivability happens right in the middle of the curve. So if you are in the middle of the curve, whatever average for whatever trait, that is the most survivable thing. And in general, if you have a really stable environment over time, your environment isn't changing, what you end up seeing is that most traits for a particular species will be have stabilizing selection act on them because the environment's not changing, so they're already adapted to their environment. So the average of that population is always moving towards the same point. Whenever you hear things like sharks are this, or this particular shark is the oldest species, or this particular type of alligator is the oldest species, they don't really mean that it's the oldest species. It may not, in fact, even be the same species that was around 65 million years ago, but the changes that have occurred to that particular species may have been very small over time because its environment may not have changed very much over time. So if its environment is very consistent over time, what ends up happening is that stabilizing selection has kept the morphology, what the animal looks like, the same over time. It doesn't have to be an animal, it could be plant or whatever, but has kept its morphology relatively the same over time. So it hasn't evolved very much. Now, technically, in this case, because the species is moving more and more towards the average, that is, the extremes are getting cut off and we're getting more and more things that are towards the average in the population, that is a change in allelic frequency. So you would still consider this to be evolution. Evolution is occurring here. There's a change in allelic frequency, but it may not be obvious to see. So when you look at the population, it may just look like there's no change occurring over time, even though there quite possibly is a change in allelic frequency. So an interesting example of this is really in humans, because humans haven't changed dramatically over the last 10, 20,000 years. Now we're talking about like modern humans here. And one aspect in which we've stayed relatively the same is our head size. And that's something that our head and brain size is something that is different from other primates. So humans have the largest brain to body size ratio of any primate. And brain to body size ratio is a predictor of intelligence in animals. And it's interesting to think about why we would be experiencing stabilizing selection. Like, why wouldn't we be experiencing directional selection? So, for example, if over here was like really big head in a baby, and then over on this side was like a little tiny head on a baby, okay? So this is like, oh my goodness, this is going to look hideous. Apologies in advance. Oh dear. Okay, over here we've got a little teeny tiny headed baby. Oh, I'm so sorry. Baby. And then over here we've got a giant headed baby. Oh, yeah. Okay. So why have we experienced stabilizing selection for this? Well, you can imagine a really, really big-headed baby is not going to survive the birthing process. It's going to get stuck. The hips, female hips, are only so large, and they can only pass a baby of a certain size. Now, we kind of break these rules a little bit in modern times because we have the ability to do a cesarean section, but that's a relatively new development in human history. For most of human history, we weren't able to just cut a mother open and remove the baby from the side hatch there. If the head was too big, that would cause death to the baby and to the mother. So we've got a selection pressure here saying, okay, heads can't be too big. Then on the other side here, we also have another selective pressure, which is that if babies' heads are born too small, you don't get adequate brain development. You don't get a fully functional human if the brain is too small at birth. And so you have a selective pressure pushing in the opposite direction, because really, really small head baby doesn't have the same survival potential and reproductive potential as a different baby, as a baby with a larger head. So you've got too small, not good, too big, not good, but there is a range of size towards the center that is like medium baby head size, that is the ideal head size. And so you get a stabilizing selection occurring that basically for the medium size head. And that's just one example, but there's lots of examples of these in nature, of genetic traits staying the same in a population over a long period of time because they are already well adapted to their particular circumstance in that area. Okay, so that's stabilizing selection, keeps things the same. Lastly, and this is kind of the coolest one in terms of evolution, the idea of disruptive selection. And that's when there is a change in the environment so that the average, what was the average of the population, is now the worst thing. The worst thing for survivability is actually the average. So a great example of this is, let's say that you have a species of bird that moves to a new island. And by moves, I mean maybe some birds are blown off course in a storm, or for whatever reason, they're transferred to a new environment. Okay, I'm going to talk about beak length here. So let's say really short-beaked birds in the population, in the variability of the population, ones that have teeny tiny beaks, are really good at catching insects. So tiny beak here is good for insect eating, and there are insects available on this island. Really big beaks are maybe good for breaking nuts. So you've got nut-breaking beaks, really big ones that are good for that, little tiny ones that are good for eating insects. But the previous food of that bird, which is maybe nectar from plants, which would be maybe a medium beak, is good for eating. I have no idea, by the way, I'm just making this example up. Is actually now totally disfavored. This food is not available on the new island. So what's happening now is the extremes are favored. Big beak is favored, little beak is favored, but whatever's in the middle is not favored. That causes disruptive selection. So this is movement away from the mean, away from the average. And what this tends to do in nature is to create two subpopulations within a species. You end up with a subpopulation that's on the extreme for a particular trait, maybe very large or very small. It doesn't have to be size related. And then you have another one that is on the other end of the spectrum for that particular trait. Maybe very intelligent, low intelligence, if low intelligence could confer some type of survivability to a population, whatever. So when you get that kind of difference appearing, a two-tiered species, over time, there's always the potential for this member of the species and this member of the species to no longer be able to recognize each other for the purpose of mating. So if these two are no longer going to mate with each other, then they suddenly are no longer the same species, and we get something called speciation occurring. Speciation is when a new species occurs. There's a split that causes one species to become two species. This is going to be the topic of our entire Wednesday lesson, so I'm not going to spend much time talking about speciation right now, but that is our next topic. And disruptive selection is one of like the major contributors to speciation. Okay, so far we've got just directional, when you get pushed in one direction from the average, so either more or less of a particular trait, whatever it happens to be. Stabilizing is when the average is the best and the two extremes are disfavored, so things get closer to the average. And disruptive, when the two extremes are the best, and so it actually moves away from the average towards the two extremes, and you often get two subpopulations forming. Okay, the last one is a little bit weird. So the last one is the idea that, so we talked about two reasons. I'm going to go back here in the note here. We talked about survival, and almost everything that I've discussed so far is in the vein of survival. That is, it allows you to find food better if you have this, or it allows you to find shelter better, or you're protected from predators, or whatever. Okay, all those things are survivability related. What I'm going to talk about now is this idea of reproduction. So this is a little bit different, because a trait could make you better at reproducing, better at finding a mate, but it could also make you less good at surviving. And that's when the idea of sexual selection comes into play. So here, we're talking about a trait that's favored because it makes you more successful at securing a mating partner. So whatever that particular thing is that makes you more appealing to the opposite sex in nature and makes you more successful at reproducing, that is going to be favored, and therefore you will want more of whatever that particular trait is. And the peacock here is a perfect example of this. So in peacocks, if you have nice big plumes of feathers and lots specifically lots of eyes on your feathers, so females look for the number of eyes, and the higher number of eyes you have on your feathers, the more a female is going to want to mate with you. Okay? And that's great. That makes you successful at mating as a male. In other words, it shows the female that you have high reproductive fitness. You probably can find food really well, because look at all these resources you claimed. You were able to make this great big plumage, and it's beautiful. So you're showing that you would make a good mating partner. The problem here is that everything about this plume is bad for survivability. So it makes it easier for predators to catch you. It makes it harder for you to fly. It makes you more obvious to predators so they can find you easier. So while it does make you more attractive to the opposite sex for mating purposes, it also makes you a lot worse at surviving. But in this case, because it makes you so much better at mating, it actually discounts the fact that you're less survivable in this case. So sometimes that wins out. Sometimes the ability to mate more often wins out over better survival traits. And when that happens, you get sexual selection. So sexual selection is just a trait that allows you to be more attractive to the opposite sex for the purposes of mating. And because of how reproductive strategies typically happen in nature between males and females, it's usually the males that are being that have to display for the females. So in that case, the males are often the ones that are going to show these unusual traits that indicate their fitness for reproduction. Females, on the other hand, if a female had this crazy plumage and they were advertising for males, this would be insanely detrimental to a female. It's got to sit on a nest. It's got to protect eggs. You can't have a giant plumage like that when you're doing that. And so this would be hugely disfavorable for a female. It would prevent your eggs from maturing. So in this case, you get a male that looks like this crazy thing over here, and then you get a female on the other side that looks like this. In other words, the male and the female are very different from one another. That is a great indicator in nature that sexual selection has occurred. Pretty much any time you see a significant morphological difference between male and female, well, there's an evolutionary reason for that. Those differences between male and female are sexually selective. That is, they make one, usually the male, more palatable for the female in terms of a reproductive partner. They make them more attractive as a reproductive partner. And so you get this difference between male and female. So a difference between male and female is called sexual dimorphism. Sexual dimorphism just means morphologically males and females look different. There are all kinds of crazy examples of this in nature. I put one into the quiz as well, the stock-eyed fly, so you can see that. There's a picture in there. It's crazy. But lions are another good example of this. There's obviously sexual dimorphism here. The male has a mane and some other characteristics that set it apart from the female, and those things demonstrate reproductive fitness. If you can grow a nice mane, it probably means you don't have disease. It probably means you have good nutrition, all the things that you look for potentially in a good mating partner that is going to produce offspring that are also having high survivability. And so therefore, there's this sexual dimorphism difference between male and female. Okay, so 4 types of selection. I'll go through them really quickly again here. Directional selection, when you're selecting towards the extreme. Stabilizing selection, when the average is the best for survival. Disruptive selection, where the 2 extremes are much better than the average for survival. And then lastly, sexual selection, where it's all about impressing usually the ladies. So the differences that are seen are always or usually to indicate fitness from a reproductive standpoint to a female. And so if you have more of that difference, you become more fit to the eyes of a female of the species, and so therefore you have better reproductive success. Your alleles are passed on more, and then therefore you see more of those alleles in the next generation. Okay, so at this point, you should try the questions from the textbook. They're all in this vein. It's pretty much just trying to figure out which type of selection is occurring in each of the instances, and then a little bit on how each of these works. And then you should try the quiz at the end. Give it a shot. Hope everybody is well. I'm glad that I was able to make another video. And I will see you guys on Wednesday, where we're going to have a discussion of speciation. Have a good one. Oh, and don't be afraid to send me your questions if you got them.